Awesome. Welcome everyone back to Accented. Tonight we're going to have the honor of speaking with Chris Santiago and Cathy Linh Che. This is our 40th episode, the premiere of our sixth season. I think this is our fifth year doing this, and today's episode is titled Ghost Wars: The Intimate Afterlives of Conflict. My name is Philip Nguyen. I'll be your co-host slash MC slash hype man for Accented Dialogues and Diaspora tonight, presented by the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, or DVAN. Before we get into that, just want to shout out and give a highlight to our new DJ for Accented, who's joining us this season, DJ Tan, aka Tan Tung. Welcome, DJ Tan. If you tell us a little bit more about who you are, what you do. I know you curated a playlist for tonight's show that we're going to be sharing out. So
Yeah, I'm a
welcome.
longtime journalist, former podcaster. Hi, Philip. Hi, everyone. I'm based here in Seattle, Washington, and I'm a music collector. So I started something called Kho Tang Nhạc Vàng, which is like the golden music era of South Vietnam. And I have about 200 vinyl records and I think almost 1,000 like song sheets that I've found from a dealer in Vietnam and just trying to preserve and trying to share and trying to understand this music and the lyrics because I think it just tells the story of our parents' generation and it's part of our own shared history as members of the Vietnamese diaspora. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Today's playlist is 15 songs. We're going to share a link for everyone, but I chose these songs specifically for a couple of reasons. One, I saw Cathy Linh Che, I saw her documentary, We Were the Scenery. And before we were the scenery to the Western world, you know, South Vietnam had a very robust music scene. And so I've selected songs that were part of the soundtrack of films that were made during that time. And so we've heard a couple of them. People are welcome to go to the playlist and enjoy some more. I'll add some show notes so people understand. And then we're going to close out at later today with some Tết Trung Thu music, since we all are getting ready for the Moon Festival or the Mid-Autumn Festival.
Awesome. Thank you for that, DJ Tan. Glad to have you on, and going from us being the scenery to us having our own soundtrack is a really beautiful thing, especially at the end of the 50th, as we approach the end of the 50th anniversary after the fall of Saigon. But thank you so much, and we'll be seeing you later on throughout the show. Well, again, welcome everyone. If you didn't know, now you know, visit DVAN.org. This show is hosted by the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, whose mission is to foster diasporic Vietnamese and Southeast Asian literary voices. We empower artists in the diaspora and champion our complex and diverse stories. We are immigrants, refugees, survivors, and their descendants, and know that our stories must be heard. And I'm here to also say that we don't have a sponsor yet for this season, season six of Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. So if you're listening to this here in the Zoom or on the video recording or on our podcast, which you can find on Apple Music and Spotify and wherever you listen to podcasts, please do consider reaching out to us to either sponsor our show, so that you could be a part of this amazing project that we're doing here. We've been doing for the past 5 years. Or if you aren't able to sponsor the show, you can still support us by visiting dvan.org/donate. And in this episode at the bottom, there would be a link where you can click that, so it's easy for you. I'd now like to introduce our co-host for Accented Dialogues in Diaspora, Mr. Viet Nguyen, whose novel The Sympathizer won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. His most recent books are Simone, a children's book illustrated by Minnie Fan, and A Man of Two Faces, a memoir, a history, a memorial. He's also the editor of the Displaced Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives and one of the co-founders of DVAN. So welcome back, Viet, to Accented.
Hey, Philip, it's great to be back here with you and on a night where we're going to be talking with two amazing poets, the first of which is Chris Santiago. He's the author most recently of the book Small Wars Manual, and before that, Tula, winner of the 2016 Lindquist and Denham Prize for Poetry and a finalist for the Minnesota Book Award. His poems have appeared in Poetry, Conduit, Copper Nickel, Poetry Northwest, Beloit Poetry Journal, American Public Media's The Slowdown, and elsewhere. The recipient of fellowships from the McKnight Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, ACLS, and Kundiman. He's a graduate of Oberlin College and received his PhD from the University of Southern California's Literature and Creative Writing program. He teaches creative writing, sound studies, and Asian American literature in the School of Critical Studies at Cal Arts. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
And our second guest is Cathy Linh Che. She is a writer and multidisciplinary artist. She is the author of Becoming Ghost, Split, and co-author with Kyle Lucia Wu of the children's book An Asian American A to Z, A Children's Guide to Our History. Her video installation, Appocalips, is an open call commission with a Shed NY, and her film, We Were the Scenery, won the Short Film Jury Award in Nonfiction at the Sundance Film Festival. She teaches as core faculty in poetry at the low residency MFA program in creative writing at Antioch University in Los Angeles and works as an executive director at Kundiman. She lives in New York City. Hello, Cathy.
Hi, happy to be here.
I am so delighted to have all of you here, here with Philip, with Thanh. But of course, the first thing I have to ask is, how are you holding up in a time of seeming apocalypse? Just to cite or paraphrase the title of one of Cathy's filmic works, it seems for some of us, at least in the United States, that this country is in a terrible crisis of many different kinds. And one of the things that gives me comfort is this show and the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network and the kinds of organizations that both of you are involved with, including Kundiman, because these organizations represent efforts at solidarity and collectivity and a faith in arts and literature and writing and storytelling and representing. So how are you doing? Cathy, let's start with you.
Well, I am tired. My brain doesn't work anymore. I think that it is because when we are witnessing, watching, participating in, afraid for our people and people who are akin to us, it is exhausting. I also feel very stubborn. I feel very stubborn and steadfast. So as a triple Taurus, I don't give up. So there's a part of me that also feels very solid and steady. I think about pest optimism quite a bit. This kind of, I read Isabella Hamad's Recognizing the Stranger, and it's not a term that, it's a term that she just references, but the idea that we know it's terrible, and yet our wills shall not be defeated. So I think that is kind of my simultaneous mode. I'm tired, but I feel steady and strong.
Steady, strong, stubborn, steadfast. Those are all really key words that you brought up, which I totally resonate with. And the book that Isabella Hamad refers to, I believe, is The Secret Life of Said the Pessimist, which is a novel by a Palestinian. Edward Said thinks it's one of the greatest Palestinian works of literature out there. I read it and I've taught it. I think it's fabulous. And that seemed to be the right word that blends pessimism and optimism. If Palestinians have had to come up with that idea to survive the past 78 years or so, that's a good model for the rest of us. Chris, how are you feeling?
Thank you for asking that question, and thanks for your answer, Cathy. Like, I tend to be a person who battles anxiety in the first place. So even before 2020, even before 2016, that's just something that is a part of my life. In 2020, I sort of felt like, see, like everybody, like, all that anxiety, it was justified. And in 2016 too. But honestly, this community, these types of things, not to sound pat, but really that gives me hope. Your work, all of your work, I've taught Cathy's work, I've taught Viet's work, I've many students have been inspired by both, and so have I as well. Also, our subject, reading and doing archival history about both my relatives who went through martial law era Philippines and ancestors who were endured the occupation of the States and Spain. It just makes me feel like it's not just to say buck up, but it's also sort of to say, well, okay, all right, now something's being asked of me, something's being asked of us to endure in these times. And so each day is difficult. I'm tired too, but Viet, I know you have family too. Everybody has people that they take care of. parents, children, and whatnot. So that keeps me going too.
Philip, what about you?
Just, I mean, I still do feel hopeful. I think I've been feeling a lot of love. I think leaning into the places where there's community, particularly ethnic racial community or organizing community. I think pest optimism also captures my sentiment right now too. Like there's this like dread and agony that's happening, but there's also I mean, if even a glimmer of hope at the end of this tunnel, day by day. So.
You know, all of us here, I believe, come from countries that have been affected by war, whether it's from Vietnam or the Philippines. Some of us are born there. Some of us are descendants from Vietnam. Some of us are descendants from the Philippines. And as Philip brought up in the introductory comments, this is the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, which concerns not only Vietnam and Vietnamese Americans, but also Filipinos and the Philippines, because the Philippines played a key role during the Vietnam War, being one of the United States' staunch allies in Southeast Asia, and Ferdinand Marcos helping to provide military bases for the United States, and the United States providing cover for Ferdinand Marcos and eventually martial law in the Philippines. So our histories as people from the Philippines or descended from the Philippines and Vietnam are really intertwined. And of course, we live in a country in which war in Asia has been a defining feature for quite a long time. And as Philip mentioned, it's the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. Cathy, I know a lot of your work, especially the most recent work in film and poetry, really deals with that. How have you been commemorating or marking this 50th anniversary?
For me, I am knowledge. I recognize something, which is my parents left Vietnam on a boat a little over 50 years ago. And 50 years ago, as I'm going through September 17th, 2025, they were in the refugee camp in the Philippines. So our histories are definitely intertwined. And so as I reflect on what it means to live as, you know, I'm 45 years old this year. So 5 years after they escaped from Vietnam, I was born. And so I think about what the duration of my life plus 5 means and what that means in terms of numerically as I am thinking about just participating in this there's so much, but participating in a genocide in Palestine with my tax dollars. And so I think for me, the message that I gather is one of I know, you know, hope and survival, because my parents, even as our relationships are strained or difficult or whatever it is, they did survive. They not only survived, but they made whole families. They made gardens, they made a home, they made, you know, my dad's a machinist. He has a couple patents in the patent office. You know, there's all these ways that they built lives after a war. So I think about the afterlife of war and what's possible. So in that way, in my book, I talk about, or I think about the possibility of what happens 50 years after the liberation of Palestine, for instance, who gets to live and who gets to build whole lives in that afterlife. So that is what I'm primarily thinking about and concerned with and trying to get us to that point, because the war did end. And for me, it is a point in history that marks, you know, my parents wouldn't agree, but it marks a moment of decolonization. And so that marker indicates to me that decolonization is possible. In fact, most countries around the world have decolonized. You know, there's obviously vestiges of colonization in every space that you're thinking about, including Vietnam. But active colonization, as it, you know, is no longer part of our, you know, everyday governance. So I think about possibility a lot during this marker.
I think also, obviously the survival issue is very important, but also the recognition of the tragedy that so many did not survive as well when we look at the history of Vietnam and the Philippines. But the other suggestion that you brought up, which is this sense of futurity is so important because it's hard to imagine what 50 years in the future will look like, but our reality in the present, if we go back to the Philippines of the 1920s or Vietnam of the 1920s, we're living in the science fictional future. Those people 100 years ago would have no idea half the things that we're doing, like this Zoom video call right now, was literally science fiction in the 1920s. And so that sense of using the futurity and imagining possible futures, not necessarily utopian futures, but at least different futures, better futures and worse futures in some ways, does give us a sense of hope where we have something to strive for, to add another S to the many S's that you've already come up with, Cathy. Chris, 50 years after the end of the Vietnam War, what are you thinking of?
Yeah, how does my audio sound now? Is it a little bit better? I just changed some
Yes.
settings. Great.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to follow off of what you said just really quickly when you were talking about science fiction, because I teach science fiction and world building in another class at my school. It's something that I'm very passionate about because I'm kind of a nerd, but it's also something that I'm working on in fiction. And yeah, there was this crazy moment of world building on the flip side of things when the White House plans, I think it was the White House plans, or was it Israel's plans for developing Gaza after the invasion leaked? I'm not sure if you saw those images. Did you see those? And it showed like these skyscraper resorts and these massive AI data centers and power plants. And so that was like this Darth Vader imperial sort of vision of what would happen to this place, just of people completely uprooted and removed from it. And so I'm planning to say in my lesson tomorrow to my world building students, world building is neither good nor bad. It's a tool that can be used for people that are trying to envision different futures. You're saying alternate futures, and we're in a future now compared to the people that we're talking about, right? 50 years on, teaching. Thank you for having me as a guest on this program, by the way, as a Filipino American. I think like that the solidarity between communities is super important, especially since so much of our history has this like shared DNA. So when I teach about 1975, and when I teach about immigrants, refugees who came to the United States in the aftermath, I can't help but think about how that's tied to the Philippine-American War and how the Philippine-American War was kind of a dry run of sorts. But then you could also say that, settler colonization of the United States was a dry run. All of these histories of violence are related. But on the hope side that Cathy is talking about, I grew up in Minnesota and I went and I taught there for 8 years with my family. And there's a great community of Southeast Asians, many of whom were refugees from the war there. And while the news is sort of awash with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the assassination of Melissa Hortman, a Minnesota congresswoman, has just been completely, and by design really, has been kind of pushed to the bottom of the news cycle. But her seat was just reclaimed by a Democrat, XP Lee, among state senator who has just taken that seat. And so that's like it's just a moment of hope and resistance right there.
Mhm. And Chris, you brought up some of the intersection between Vietnamese Philippine identity. I think for me, my parents on the way to the United States stopped by in Bataan in the Philippines. So I think like for me personally, there's a connection there. We know about the refugee camps that existed there throughout history. In this moment, we're also seeing one of the things I've noticed, at least with my students, and when we're talking about war, and especially with ethnic studies, there's this we try to unpack American exceptionalism through the lens of decolonization, understanding what it means to be what U.S. imperialism is. Um, can I ask you, how do you see where is it in your classroom or in your work that you see the experiences of war and U.S. imperialism intersecting between the Vietnamese and Philippine experiences, particularly as it comes out in literature and poetry?
Part of it is that I think that rise of consciousness of Asian American identity that happens largely in resistance to the war and what was happening in Vietnam and out of that out of the Asian American movement, the solidarity that forms between communities. My parents came in 1969. They were both immigrants, but the subtext of their immigration is that they're fleeing the instability of the martial law era. My mother's one brother was a political prisoner of the Marcos regime, and her younger brother was killed while being arrested and resisting Marcos's secret police. So there was definitely this climate of fear. My mom had wanted to be a journalist, actually, and her mom said no, there's no way you can be a journalist. You know what they're doing to journalists right now. And she sent her to nursing school, which was kind of a boot camp, apparently, but it also facilitated her immigration to the United States because of after the 1965 immigration law, nurses and doctors were some of the categories of people who were allowed finally to immigrate to the United States from Asia. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think
Yeah.
it's a complicated history and engage complicated history and connection with America as a state, especially as it's. I oftentimes think of that this phrase. We are here because you were there. Especially when I'm thinking about Vietnamese American identity and experience and how our community came into emergence. I want to pitch that question at you too, Kathy. How do you see the intersections of Vietnamese and Philippine experiences and the way that it might come out in your work, or even experiences of solidarity?
Thank you for asking that question because so much of my work is set in the Philippines because my parents, as extras in Apocalypse Now, they were recruited from the refugee camp in the Philippines, where they stayed for 11 months. I have never lived anywhere outside of the US for 11 months. So it's a very significant period of time for my parents. And part of their narrative, which is in the film, and there's a 3-channel video installation as well. And that longer video installation, what is really apparent in my parents' storytelling and throughout my life was how moved they were by the kindness of people who shared food with them, who made sure that they had a way forward, who made sure they could survive when they were really, really without a home, without a place. So I think that that type of kindness, that is also a form of solidarity or mutual aid, because I know that years later, when there was a typhoon and people were displaced from their home in the Philippines. In fact, a lot of people in the Philippines who were displaced by Typhoon Haiyan ended up in the same refugee camp where my parents ended up. And during that time, I think Vietnamese people sent over $1 million in aid and relief because there was a recognition that they, when they had nowhere to go, they were taken in and treated well. And so there's a lot of, people think of solidarity as just being out in the streets, but um, it's also, just feeding somebody else that you see is in need. And so I think of that as part of our intertwined history, our shared history. And I think to Chris's point, you know, people at part of the Asian American movement, the Filipinos in the United States, opened the pathway for refugees to come to the United States. If people hadn't fought so hard, then people like my parents wouldn't necessarily have safe harbor.
You know, when I got to the Philippines for the first time and visited Manila a couple of years right before the pandemic, I was struck by how similar it felt to Saigon. The weather, the traffic, some of the architecture. And I have a Filipino colleague and friend, Oscar Capamanias, a professor at Ateneo de Manila, who you might know, who's had the same experience when he went to Saigon. He's like, oh my God, is that the Philippines? So we already share that. So maybe there was some way in which when the Vietnamese refugees arrived in the Philippines, obviously it was a discombobulating experience, but it maybe wasn't as radically different as we might have assumed, simply because some of the climate and some of the culture seemed similar. Now, for those of you who don't know, Cathy made a movie called We Were the Scenery about her parents' experiences. And when I heard about this film, I was like blown away because in The Sympathizer, my novel, I'd written about the making of a movie like Apocalypse Now, which included Vietnamese refugees. Because when I found that out, that these people in the movie were actually Vietnamese refugees, basically fresh from the Vietnam War and in a refugee camp in the Philippines. And now that they were being drafted or strongly persuaded to participate as extras in a movie where they would play basically their enemy, the Vietnamese guerrillas or the Viet Cong, I was blown away and I had to write about it. But in the back of my mind, I was also thinking, wow, who were those people? What must it have been like to be these people? And then along comes Cathy, who makes a movie about her parents and who also wrote a book of poetry, a great book called Becoming Ghost, which has been longlisted for the National Book Award in Poetry. So congratulations. We're going to show a trailer for We Were the Scenery, but before we get to that, Cathy, I mean, at what age did your parents first talk about this history? And how long did it take you to process that information before you could eventually get to the point where you would actually make creative works about your parents and their experiences?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I don't have a specific memory of them saying it for the first time because in my recollection, this is a story I've heard my entire life. There's not a moment that I was alive where I didn't know about them being in Apocalypse Now. Now, I didn't know what Apocalypse Now was, and I didn't even know what the word apocalypse meant. My dad said, "Do you know the film Apocalypse Now?" I'm a child. I'm like, "No, I don't know what you're talking about." But then they launch into the story. So I've known it my whole life. It's always been fascinating to me. I mean, all of their stories are fascinating to me. They're amazing storytellers. Um, and so much of this film is them, it's driven all by their voices. It's their storytelling and it's also their gossip, which is, I think, one of the most supreme versions of storytelling that I know of. It's so engaging. It's so amazing. And yeah, when I started writing this book, it took a long time. It took 10 years to figure out how to write the book. And then it took some time to make the film as well, a good number of years. And part of that was, first of all, being convinced that this story, which I always knew was kind of important to me, actually was very important to have as part of the larger conversation around the Vietnam War, because Apocalypse Now takes up so much of the American imaginary of what the war looks like and feels like and says and acts like. So I was convinced by some Vietnamese American professors or fans of Apocalypse Now or people who just know of its legacy, that it's important for a Vietnamese person to tell the story. It's important for people who have a first person experience or stake in it to tell the story. It's important for a woman to talk about the Vietnam War, even just because so much of Vietnam War film is so hyper masculine. So it's all about bodies and explosions and, the moral quandaries of American GIs as they are, annihilating people, right? So I think that I wanted to provide an wonderfully intimate counterpoint in my parents' story in the film. And the book is also a wrestling with our internal family dynamics on top of it. The film itself has no family dynamic. It's just like a celebratory telling of my parents' film, but the book has a little bit of the behind the scenes of the making of that film itself. So it took a long time just because of that, and also just trying to figure out aesthetically how to approach it. And that's why there's a film, that's why there's a poetry book, that's why I'm working on prose, that's why I'm working on performance and video installation, because in some ways the story feels very big and each medium presents different opportunities to tell it in a fuller way. So I think of all of these as very related, companion, all one thing, multiple things.
Yeah, I'm so fascinated by that because that's obviously an incredible story and it's something that has shaped your parents' lives and your life and therefore is now embedded in your poetic psyche. And in some ways, Apocalypse Now, this movie that was so totemic in the American imagination
It
and also
is.
the worthy film. My students today, all born after 9/11, have never seen this movie. So
Mhm.
the cultural reference is disappearing, but for a
Yep.
certain generation, it's still valid. And as of a couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump posted a meme with him as Colonel Kilgore from Apocalypse Now in a meme that says Apocalypse Now because he's preparing to send ICE into Chicago. And says, I love the smell of deportations in the morning, referring to Kilgore saying, I love the smell of napalm in the morning. So Donald Trump, for better or for worse, is a part of this generation that knows what Apocalypse Now, or perhaps thinks he knows what Apocalypse Now means, because he doesn't understand that Kilgore is satirized in the movie as a stupid American was, saturated with bloodlust, which Donald Trump is, in my opinion. But anyway, the Apocalypse Now is this incredible cultural influence for at least a few decades, and your movie references that. Now, before we show the trailer, I just need to ask, and this is a stupid question, Cathy, but how do your parents say apocalypse now? Because Vietnamese people have a particular take on English. Do they say apocalypse now like you and I say it, or do they say it in the Vietnamese American way?
Say it in a Vietnamese American way with with yo, which means
Like
diacritical.
apocalypse or apoca what? Like, I'm just kind of curious.
Uh,
Okay.
yeah, up, they say apocalypse now, like apocalypse.
Apocalypse now. Yeah. See,
Yeah.
so
But it's
I
in the film. They say it in the film. So
would say to them,
I
yeah,
don't know if I'm saying it correctly, but they say it in the film, so you
yeah,
can get their sort of, because it's a tonal language, so it moves up.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, talking about apocalypse now, Vietnamese people can't say Chicago. They say Chicago. All right. Now, with that little bit of ethnographic insight, Philip, let's show the trailer for We Were the Scenery.
Má không có thích đi đóng phim. Không có ý đi đóng phim.
Thì mình biết là hãng phim Mỹ thì phải cũng có người đạo diễn rồi đó kia thôi chứ còn gì. Không có nhận ra. Nếu mà gặp ổng thì mình nói tôi biết là ông là tôi đặc biệt.
We will talk more to Cathy about We Were the Scenery, as well as her book, Becoming Ghosts. But I want to turn to Chris, because, in fact, Chris's last book, Small Wars Manual, is pretty much related to this kind of larger history we've been discussing about how the United States, the Philippines, and Vietnam have all been connected, because Chris wrote a poetry book called Small Wars Manual, which is based upon an actual military book produced by the United States military called Small Wars Manual, which is an accumulated body of knowledge about various small wars that the United States was engaged in, which included the Philippine-American War, which was in many ways a foreshadowing of what would happen in Vietnam. And then the war in Vietnam would be a foreshadowing of what would happen in other small wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, the irony here is that these are not small wars. They might be relatively small wars for the United States, with 58,000 Americans dead in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, 5,000 or so dead in Iraq and Afghanistan, maybe 1,000, I think, in the Philippine-American War. Relatively small wars, but we're talking about 3 million Vietnamese dead, several million Lao, Hmong, and Cambodian dead, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Afghans dead, anywhere from 100,000 to 1 million dead Filipinos, depending on your estimates. And the U.S. Army in the early 20th century was estimating deaths of at least 600,000 Filipinos. So Small Wars Manual, incredibly ironic and devastating for people who lived through those wars, and then for their subsequent generations, like everybody here. Chris, tell us about how you came across the idea for Small Wars Manual.
Yeah, small wars don't feel small to those who are living through them. Yeah, I think when I first started thinking about this subject, I was in the Philippines. I was trying to meet with Oscar, actually, your friend, but it didn't work out in terms of our timing. But I was visiting archives for a novel project But then I found out about the Small Wars Manual, which is a U.S. Marine Corps document published in 1932. But as you said, it includes this accumulated knowledge from at least the Philippine-American War and before that. And the DNA is so strong in it. Like you can see in there's a chapter on ambush. And the ambush chapter specifically talks about bolo attacks, like the bolo knife, which is a kind of a large machete that's used in the Philippines both for farming, but also was used for war because there weren't enough guns for partisans to fight back first against the Spanish and then against the Americans. And so when I found out about this manual, I thought, Small Wars Manual, there's literally a manual that tells you how to conduct these wars. And so I started reading it, and it's not a very exciting read. It's, a lot of bureaucratic, um, um, that sort of language that's flat. And I thought, at the time, I was reading a book by Srikanth Reddy called Voyager, in which he erases the memoir of the former UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim, who it was revealed was a Nazi after he had served his term as a Secretary General. And so he erased that memoir. And I thought, well, this seems like a text that would be, just perfect to grapple with in that way. So it took me a decade to figure out how to do it. But I erased that manual. I went through and I used it as a starting ground. Instead of having a blank page and writing poems from the blank page, I started with these pages that had lots of words on them, and I started to erase it. And it felt to me I guess I was sort of doing a violence to the text itself, or at least I was doing a recovery. It sort of felt like a violence, but it also felt sort of like I was salvaging inside it for words to turn into poems.
I have so much to say about this Small Wars Manual, because again, I think you and other poets like Srikanth Reddy, as you've talked about, have been grappling with this question of how bureaucratic language becomes so important in conquest and colonization. Like the very idea of small wars, again, it is small from the U.S. They are small from the U.S. perspective, devastating from the perspective of the indigenous people and natives and residents of these countries. I think also of poets like
Solomon
Somali
poet
Sharif. Yeah.
Samal Sharif, I'm so sorry,
Yeah.
who wrote Look, for example, which was based on the US military dictionary and was looking at this intensely bureaucratic language that was masking just how devastating things like drone strikes were on the people who were being afflicted by them. So the terrain of language is absolutely crucial to conquest and domination and the US military. How do you as a poet relate to that, Chris?
Um, that's an interesting question. There's a poem at the end of the book where I say, uh, "My children have never seen war, but they've also never lived without it." And that's sort of true for me as well, that like I've never lived in a battle zone. Although I think everyone that lived through the lockdown, it felt like a battle zone, right? Especially if you're in a place like Minneapolis or Los Angeles where there were protests that were happening at the same time. It felt akin to it. I don't want to like do a disservice to people that actually have lived through war to compare it to those things. But I think part of it was in a way, how do you like, if you're writing a work of historical fiction, how do you enter into the minds of the people who are living through those experiences? And I mean, you can do interviews, you can talk to survivors if you're writing about something within living memory. You can do archival research. But I wanted to enter into the history in a way that was more immediate, both in the sense of, time, but also like unmediated. And so I thought by entering into this text that had been created out of the experiences of war and sort of being inside it, in a way I could kind of, sort of like doing a seance in a way, not to sound like too hokey about it, but it felt like kind of trying to recover voices of people that had been silenced through the work that this created this manual.
I think that's a good segue back to you, Kathy. Your second poetry collection, titled Becoming Ghosts, seance, ghosts, haunting, conjuring, absence, transformation. Also, congratulations on being longlisted for the 2025 National Book Awards. Could you share a little bit more about what Becoming Ghosts means to you and what's been your family's reception to being longlisted for this award?
Thank you so much. So my family doesn't know I've been longlisted, I don't think. I haven't told them. I don't talk to them about this type of stuff, but my family does like awards. There's no question. Like, there's a wall in the hallway with my report cards that like my middle school, Lindbergh Middle School, embossed my middle school straight A's with like my fake absences. I've never been absent a day of my life in my K through 12 education, except for one day in kindergarten. And I remember as a child, I was like, never again. Anyway, um, so Becoming Ghost as a book, it thinks a little bit, it has multiple meanings, just thinking about the ways that my parents were ghosted, in Apocalypse Now as background extra. In fact, the main scene that they showed me years later, I didn't know this, but so this is a photo, and for those on the podcast, I will describe it, but it's a photo of my father and he is holding a baby, and that baby is me. And on the background, you can't see it very well because it's just newsprint, but it's a collage that has film still of Apocalypse Now. And it's when Robert Duvall, Sergeant Kilgore says, "Napalm son, nothing else in the world smells like that. I love the smell of napalm in the morning." Meanwhile, in the background, in the far distance, there's all of these figures, people walking across the back. They're playing prisoners of war. And my parents are among that group, right? And the smoke is rising, all of this stuff, because it's in the aftermath of napalm being dropped. So there's a kind of ghostliness to that visual imagery that happens. And so they're behind the smoke as almost these apparitional figures. So there's that. There's also what Chris mentioned about poetic seance. So part of the project of this book is to write in different voices, including my father, my mother, my grandmother, who is no longer alive, and I haven't spoken 3 words to because I only met her on her deathbed when she couldn't speak anymore. So there's a kind of way where in order to write this book, I had to do a poetic seance. I had to become these ghosts. And my mother's alive, and so I could, there are poems in here that are direct translations of some of the interviews, but there are poems that are sort of ingested into my body, and they come out, and that's how they formulate, right? In English, through my knowledge base, through all of these things, but it is only possible through the deep listening that happens in that regard. And I guess the final thing is my dad disowned me during the research process of this book. And so I was thinking, oh, I've become a ghost to him. He's become a ghost to me. What are our ghost selves doing in the world during this time? So there's a lot of different types of ways that ghosts are not only just sort of figures of loss, but it's also a figure of recovery. And so I think that that recovery is what allows for me to create this, restorative archive.
I'm so sad to hear about your father. I think a lot about the fact that for those of us who become writers, we get into very dangerous terrain, which is the terrain of betrayal. And we want to tell stories because we want to be loyal to the history of our family, our communities, justice, truth, and so on. But our families may not interpret that impulse in the same way. And so for a lot of writers of color, probably especially women writers of color, the charge of somehow betraying your family or do something, whatever it is that compels a parent to disown you. I mean, that's such a real danger of the writing. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit further
Sure, I'm
because it's
happy
such a
to. And
statement.
he didn't disown me because I wrote about him, but he disowned me because I spoke up, right? There's a kind of
Mhm.
way where my father is turning 86 this year, and there's an expectation, I think, that, I'm a woman and I'm his daughter and I don't speak up and I agree. And unfortunately, when you're a writer, you do. You learn, you find your voice, you have opinions, you speak up. And I think that it's an interesting thing because so many of my Vietnamese American friends have been disowned by their fathers or they have or mothers or parents and they have disowned them,
Mm.
so there's a lot of disowning happening. I don't feel alone, even though to be honest, there was tremendous grief in it, and there still is a lot of difficulty. I also feel a strong sense of kinship, and through that, a lot of love, because I think for him, it's the sign that he feels like he's lost control. He's lost control of this person that he feels like is part of him. So I think that there is something just I'm not a parent myself, but there's something that I feel very connected to when I think about this act of saying, no, you couldn't possibly be my daughter anymore. You're contradicting me. That's like, how can you love me and contradict me? It's not possible. So that rupture happens through through language, through linguistic like through my own opinion emerging somewhere. So I think that it's complicated with Vietnamese families in the US in particular. And I think that um, I think that people want to connect it to intergenerational trauma or migration. And I think all of these things are true, but I think it's also my dad. I don't know. Like it's me. It's not just my dad, it's me. It's like who we are. There's something about us that created that break. And um I still feel that bridge to this like other way. Sometimes like when language doesn't draw us together, like feeling is what draws me to my dad still, even if I don't think we can talk or communicate very well. He still like points to the prizes.
Yeah, see, I mean, the awards are still hanging in the hallway, and even if he
Yeah.
disowns you and doesn't talk to you personally, to his friends, he's like, "Oh, my daughter, maybe she'll win an Oscar someday." If you win an Oscar for a short documentary, I think everything will probably be cured, especially if you invite him. But what we'll see. Anyway, I'm
We'll
really sad to
see.
hear.
We'll see. We'll see. Yeah, but I mean, it's TBD, and I think it's kind of a like part of that, part of this book is working it out and trying to move toward forgiveness. And I think for me, it is a betrayal to write about it for him, maybe. We haven't, I told my siblings that don't tell dad that I wrote this book. But I think that I feel pretty proud of it because I was honest, I honored myself, but I also talked openly about not just, the things that he's said or done that hurt me, but also like the things that I said or did that might have hurt him. And there's a kind of love that and complexity and I really care about that.
Mm.
The wholeness of the family drama.
And the irony of it all is that all of this material is material for future poetry. So that's the only bright side for the trials that poets and writers undergo. Chris, you're going to bless us with a reading from Small Wars Manual at this point, I believe.
Yeah, thanks for having me read. This is the book, by the way. Oh, it's blurred because of my background, so I should have to turn off my own video. I'll just read this to you. So erasure poems, if you don't know, are poems that are taken from an original text and you sort of black out words that you don't want and keep the words that you do want. So this is from chapter 15 of the Small Wars Manual. It's called Withdrawal. So the book starts off talking about the Philippine-American War, and as you progress through the book, it sort of moves to later conflicts. And this one was meant to evoke both the catastrophic evacuation from Afghanistan, which happened more recently, but also catastrophic evacuation from Saigon. 15, withdrawal. 1, expect withdrawal symptoms. Expect anxiety, depression, the inability to fire and forget. 2, when the outlying districts smolder, when the crowds crush the barbed wire, the airfield, the crowds. When evacuees cleave to wing and wheel well, we fall in supplication. 3. A surge is an open secret, so is a drawdown. A fragment of a fragment can still be lethal. Isn't the body a cargo hold crammed with the dead and the chance for continuity? A C-17 can airlift oversized payloads, medical supplies, presidential motorcades, even 800 refugees shoulder to shoulder, a waiting room packed with names that may never be called.
Ooh, thank you, Chris. And haunting snaps.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really inspired by how y'all both weave the personal, the familial with the institutional, systemic, all of the historical aspects of your own personal your lives and the histories that your families come from. I It's so grateful to have y'all as our start to season 6 of Accented, uh, our 48th show. Um, we're kind of coming up on on some of the final questions. For our podcast listeners, um, and for y'all, just to know that we're also going to be broadcasting on KALW, which is a Bay Area based radio show. So for the folks here in the Zoom and for the folks on the radio and podcasts, to have a chance to engage a little bit more with your work, to learn more about you, to listen to the playlist that DJ Amtan put together, and then to also see all the links and resources that we have as sort of addenda to your the conversation that we've been having today. One question that I have to kind of lead us into that closeout is where where is it that we can find you? What are you working on next? What's on the horizon as we end the 50th anniversary of the wars in Vietnam and Southeast Asia? What direction are we going towards next? Or are you going towards next? I'll start with you, Chris.
Yeah, I have a novel that's been in the works for some time. It's been kind of hard. It's hard to write because of the subject, but it's about the Philippine American War and the African American soldiers who defected to the Filipino side. So David Fagan is the most famous of these defectors, and he even became a captain in the Philippine Republican Army at the time. And a price was put on his head. There's even a New York Times article about him that you could find pretty easily if you Google it. The claim to have caught him and killed him, but there was some dispute about whether it was actually him whose body was turned in, or the head that was severed from the body that was turned in. So he's kind of like this mythical bandit figure, but also a figure of just you know solidarity across communities, and also kind of a tragic figure too as well. So that's something that I'm working through.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Happy.
Chris, that's so exciting that you've been working on a novel for so long. So my short film is Oscar eligible, so we are running an Oscar campaign. Yeah, so we are December 16th is the day that they announced the short list. And so yeah, just just to note that November 1st is when the film will be available on the Criterion channel. So we're very excited about that. After that, I am also working on a feature-length fictional screenplay that is about the same story because we want to try it all, right? And I think there's something the documentary, I love that the fact that it's nonfiction is amazing, but I think the immersion of fiction also is very powerful. And then the final project I'm working on is well, there's two more. One is nonfiction. So I'm working on nonfiction. Again, the idea that the poetry book does something amazing with form and compression, and the film does something amazing with my parents' voices, and the nonfiction is a space that where I get to expand upon all of it, including just, like for instance, I talk about my father, but he actually at some point when I apologized, with the way that my mom trained me to, he came back with an explanation of things, and that was very tender to me. So there's a lot of movement all throughout. And the final thing is I'm just writing poems every day. And some of these poems I'm exploring how to be a little funny. It's always so dead serious, you know? Like Vietnamese people are very funny, so we need to create spaces in Vietnamese American literature to capture our whole selves. So Lê Thị Diễm Thuy, she says, you know, I want to bring whole Vietnamese bodies into the room. So my dad is very funny, he's very charming. I am very funny and charming, I swear. I'm not just sad all the time. And so I want to explore tone in a different way because I think a Vietnamese American literature deserves it. We have you know, we're so complex and funny and strange. So I want to do us a service and do myself a service in that way, and my parents as well.
I will agree that contemporary American poetry doesn't have much of a sense of humor. So more power to you there. And
Yeah,
of course, I think
some does, but not
some
mine.
does, but not
Some do.
generally, you know.
Yeah.
But also, of course, this idea of making a fiction film about the experiences of your parents or these refugees in the camp in the Philippines, making Apocalypse Now. That's a brilliant idea. Let's hope that that will work out. We do have a question from a member of the audience, Steve Fujimura, who asks, just wondering, in the process of writing your books and making your film, Cathy and Chris, did you have a moment in which you wanted to stop writing? And if so, why and how did you continue? Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I think working your way through a manual of basically multiple genocides is pretty hard to keep with. But the thing about erasure, when you're going through line by line of someone else's text, and for me, I was sort of highlighting words I wanted. Some people black it out. Some people actually like, you know, cut pages up or use whiteout. I was using a highlighter, but it becomes sort of detached. You're sort of like disassociated from the task of it in a way. You're taking a pass through it and sort of like looking at these words. It's almost like doing a crossword puzzle. And then after a while, you start to see, oh, what have I done? I kept this word and that word, and you start to see patterns in it. So it's a way to sort of let go of yourself. But another way that I kept going is just to turn to another project, you know, to work on the fiction stuff for a while or to work on teaching things for a while. That's always a good way to sort of just I need to set that aside. And then sometimes when you come back to it, like your unconscious was working on it anyway. Um, yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, so I'll just say I agree with Chris that having multiple things to work on has been helpful because putting all the energy into this book for 10 years was difficult. It's like, you know, I'm pulling my hair trying to figure it out, and it's why won't it work? You know, why is it not working? Why is it not figuring itself out? And then along the way, I'm collaborating with a friend and writing a children's book. So that was so nice. And then along the way, I have this film. So sometimes people are like, I feel like you're doing a lot of stuff. I'm like, I am, but I actually find that the multiplicity of activities helps to feed, if, you know, taking a break from one thing helps to feed the other thing. And so I enjoy being able to move between things. I was a poet only for much of my creative life, and only during 2020 did I change. So 5 years did I sort of explore different genres or collage or things like that. And I'm grateful for that because otherwise I'd be a very frustrated person all the time.
I think there's a whole genre of poets who've gone on to do other things. Poets writing novels, now poets making movies. Come on, leave something for the rest of us. I can't think of very many or any novelists who become poets. It's always in the other direction. Probably because maybe it's a little bit easier to expand versus to compress. Here we are at the end of this great conversation with Cathy Linh Che, author of Becoming Ghost and the filmmaker of We Were the Scenery, hopefully up for Oscar contention. December. We'll keep our fingers crossed. Chris Santiago, author of the book Small Wars Manual. Philip Nguyen, all-around Vietnamese American Renaissance man. And DJ Thanh, who will lead us out with her selections.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Enjoy the music. Give me a second.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.